Alexis Carter walked into the courtroom, a black federal prosecutor falsely accused and without a defense attorney. The air in the room grew heavy the moment she entered. Everyone thought she had already lost. Judge Jonathan Wallace squinted down at her from the high bench, his gaze filled with skepticism. Prosecutor Michael Tate crossed his arms, sneering with contempt. He had crushed countless defendants without lawyers, and today Alexis would be his next victim. "This case is crystal clear," Tate declared, his voice dripping with smug confidence. "The evidence is overwhelming. The witnesses have confirmed it. Justice will be served." Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Everyone believed this was just a simple trial, a verdict already sealed. A black woman defending herself? Ridiculous. But then Alexis looked up and flashed a smile that instantly chilled the room. They thought she was the prey. They didn't know they had just walked into her game. She calmly stared at Tate, waiting for his first move. He was so overconfident he didn't even realize he was the one walking into a trap. No one in the courtroom knew that the woman standing before them was not just a defendant. She was one of the best prosecutors in the country, and they were about to witness the most spectacular reversal of fortune they had ever seen. Could Alexis turn the tables on those who had already sealed her fate? What would make the entire courtroom fall silent when the truth was revealed? Hit subscribe now so you don't miss the most shocking twist in courtroom history. Alexis Carter was no ordinary woman. She was a federal prosecutor with a brilliant career, a name that made many in the legal world take notice. Born and raised in a poor neighborhood where injustice and violence seeped into every corner, she understood the value of justice from an early age. She didn't take the easy path. In a judicial system riddled with prejudice, where race still posed an invisible barrier, Alexis carved her own way with intelligence, determination, and courage. She was not one to be easily defeated. While many colleagues chose to turn a blind eye to the unseen forces at play, Alexis was the one who dared to face them head-on. The cases she took on were never simple. She targeted the corrupt, the criminals closely linked to the political elite, those who roamed free because they knew how to exploit the system's flaws. This made her a thorn in many people's sides. Countless times, she received anonymous threats, warnings that she was pushing too far, but she never backed down. However, despite being a well-known prosecutor, she had never been treated fairly. At every trial, she felt the skeptical gazes of judges, of colleagues, of those who didn't believe a black woman could occupy this position. Her victories were not only victories for the law, but victories over centuries of prejudice. But as she advanced further, she began to realize that the system she had trusted wasn't as fair as she had once believed. In the judicial world, no one was unaware of Alexis Carter. Her colleagues respected her, but many also resented her. She was a symbol of integrity, but that very integrity made her a target. Those in power were always looking for ways to bring people like her down. She knew this well, but she never imagined that one day she would find herself standing in the dock. Her name had once been synonymous with resounding victories, cases that made the wealthy and powerful tremble. But now, that very name appeared on an indictment. She had once believed that justice could protect her, but now, standing on the brink of collapse, she began to understand a bitter truth. Justice was not for everyone. The case began like any other. Alexis Carter had investigated a massive corruption scandal with signs of foul play. But as she dug deeper, she realized she had stepped into dangerous territory. The names in the files weren't just ordinary businessmen or low-level officials. They were influential figures within the political and judicial systems. She was used to threats when dealing with forces like these, but this time something was different. The silence was too perfect. Documents disappeared without a trace, and witnesses suddenly changed their testimony in inexplicable ways. A vague feeling crept into her mind. Someone was manipulating the entire case. Everything changed overnight. The police raided her apartment, bringing with them an arrest warrant and evidence she had never seen before. They claimed she was involved in the money laundering scheme she had been investigating. Millions of dollars had been transferred through accounts linked to her, and internal emails seemed to prove she had deliberately misdirected the investigation. Alexis stood motionless as the cold cuffs tightened around her wrists. She knew she hadn't done it. She knew this was a trap, but it was too late. The days that followed were a nightmare. All her colleagues who had once stood by her side fell silent. Some even publicly turned their backs. She was immediately suspended, her reputation destroyed in a matter of hours. Headlines across the news read, "Federal prosecutor charged with corruption, a betrayer of justice." But what shocked her most wasn't the betrayal from the media, it was who was behind the case: Prosecutor Michael Tate. Tate was the type of person who was always waiting for an opportunity to rise at any cost. He didn't care about justice. He only cared about fame and power. For years, he had struggled to outmaneuver Alexis, but she had always been the barrier he couldn't surpass. Now, with these charges, he could easily ruin her and remove her from his path. When Alexis was brought into the interrogation room, Tate sat across from her, flipping through the case files with a smug look on his face. "Such a shame, Alexis," he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "I always thought you were smart, but I guess even the best make mistakes." She stared him down, unwavering. "I didn't make a mistake, Tate. And you know that." He smirked, reclining in his chair. "Whether you did or not doesn't matter anymore. The issue is there's too much evidence against you. And trust me, the jury won't take long to convict you." She knew he was right. The evidence had been perfectly planted. He didn't need to do much. All he had to do was let the system he served destroy her. For the first time in her career, Alexis realized that the law, the very thing she had spent her life protecting, was no longer on her side. This time, she wasn't the prosecutor, she was the defendant. And she knew that if she didn't fight back, she would be buried forever. Alexis Carter had once been the pride of the judicial system, a federal prosecutor unafraid to confront the most powerful forces. But in less than a week, everything came crashing down faster than any storm she had ever witnessed. The colleagues who had stood by her side in major cases, those who had raised a glass to celebrate victories with her, now turned their backs as though they had never known her. No one called. No one asked if she was okay. She didn't know who among them truly believed she was guilty or who simply feared being implicated by standing with her. The press dove into the scandal like vultures circling around a decaying corpse. On the front pages of major newspapers, articles appeared with venomous headlines: "Prosecutor Alexis Carter, Defender of Justice or the Greatest Fraud? Female Prosecutor Falls from Grace, a Lesson in Greed." Television programs dissected every detail of the case, with experts in the studio shaking their heads, expressing their disappointment in her. No one cared about the truth. They only needed a sensational story, and she was the perfect figure to be placed on the public's chopping block. Prosecutor Michael Tate continued to press her mercilessly. After the first hearing, she was indefinitely suspended, her license to practice temporarily revoked. No office, no support team, no access to the system she once controlled. She walked out of the federal building where she had worked, feeling the weight of judgmental eyes on her. The security guards who had greeted her every morning now quietly looked down, avoiding her gaze as if touching her would curse them. Standing alone in the middle of the city, Alexis realized a bitter truth. She had lost everything. Not just her job or reputation, but the trust of those she had once believed would stand by her. She realized no one would help her. No lawyer would take her case, not because they believed she was guilty, but because they understood how the system worked. Anyone who dared to defend Alexis Carter would be swept up in the whirlwind Tate had created. She had no choice but to fight alone. When she received the official documentation of her case, she stared at the bolded words, "Defendant Alexis Carter." She had never imagined a day when she would find herself in this position. But if the legal system had turned its back on her, she would fight on her own terms. This time, there were no teammates, no superiors, no system of support behind her. She had only one weapon left, herself, and she decided she would not lose. The heavy courtroom door swung open, and all eyes immediately fixed on Alexis Carter. A wave of whispers quickly spread through the gallery as she entered, her wrists still marked from the handcuffs the night before. The sound of her high heels clicking on the marble floor echoed in the ominous silence. No one offered her comfort. No one showed even the slightest sympathy, only skeptical, derisive stares and words of contempt. Judge Jonathan Wallace sat high on the bench, looking down at her with indifference. He made no attempt to hide his bias. From the moment he slammed the gavel to start the trial, the air in the room shifted. An invisible coldness spread throughout the space. No one had to say it, but everyone understood this trial wasn't about justice. It was about methodically crushing Alexis Carter. Across from her, Michael Tate stood tall, his posture brimming with confidence. He glanced at her, then cracked a thin, mocking smile before turning to the jury with a slight nod. He seemed to tell them that she had already lost the moment she walked in. The trial of defendant Alexis Carter is now in session. Judge Wallace's voice was cold, unwavering. Mr. Tate, would you like to present your opening statement? Tate stood, adjusted his tie, and moved to stand before the jury. His voice carried the weight of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not complicated. The defendant, a former federal prosecutor, has used her position to cover up illegal activities. We have evidence, witnesses, and a series of financial transactions directly linked to her. He paused for a moment, scanning the jury as if daring them to miss his every word. But there's something more concerning than just this single crime. This is a betrayal of the very system we trust. Tate's words landed like a sharp blow to Alexis's honor. She had no right to object. No one was there to defend her. All she could do was sit there, listening as the man who had orchestrated it all spun a tale that was not hers. The jury began nodding, a few exchanging glances. Some looked sympathetic, but most were already swept up in the narrative Tate had crafted. This was exactly what he wanted. Alexis took a deep breath, but she could feel the walls of the room closing in on her. Everything was moving too quickly, but she knew one thing. This was not a fair trial. This was a performance designed to ensure that she would never rise again. And if she didn't act fast, they would succeed. Michael Tate stepped forward into the courtroom, his cold gaze sweeping over the jury before he placed a file on the podium. He exhaled slowly, as if preparing to reveal a bombshell. Your Honor, he began, his voice brimming with confidence. The evidence we have will prove that defendant Alexis Carter was not only present at the scene, but had a clear motive to commit the crime. Tate slowly opened the file, deliberately turning each page to build suspense. We have a witness, a dedicated police officer who was there immediately after the incident. He gestured toward the witness stand. Please welcome Officer Daniel Harper. A man in a police uniform stood and walked up to the stand, his posture rigid, but his gaze unwavering. Tate moved closer, placing his hand on the edge of the witness stand as though he controlled the entire trial. Officer Harper, could you describe what you saw the night of the incident? Harper nodded, his voice firm. When we arrived at the scene, we found the victim lying on the ground. When we asked the people who were present, they all stated that the defendant, Ms. Carter, had argued with the victim just before. Tate raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. So, was there a witness who actually saw Ms. Carter attack the victim? Harper shook his head. No one saw it firsthand, but according to the testimonies, Ms. Carter was the last person near the victim before he fell. Alexis clenched her fists, but she couldn't object at this point. Tate knew that. Was there any surveillance footage of the incident? Tate pressed further. Harper shook his head again. No, sir. The cameras in that area were not functioning at the time of the crime. A wave of whispers spread throughout the courtroom. Tate turned slowly, walking toward the jury as if he had just dropped an important bombshell. No cameras, but we have a witness. Let me call the next one. He turned to a woman with brown hair sitting near the witness stand. Please welcome Miss Diana Brooks. Diana Brooks, a middle-aged office worker, walked up with a tense posture. She cleared her throat, her eyes avoiding Alexis's as she sat down. Tate smiled gently, as if reassuring a sensitive witness. Miss Brooks, could you tell the court what you saw that night? Diana swallowed nervously. I saw Miss Carter standing near the victim. They seemed to be having a very heated argument. Tate nodded sympathetically. And then what happened? Then I heard a scream. When I looked back, the victim was on the ground, and Ms. Carter was still standing there. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Tate turned to the jury, his eyes gleaming with triumph. No cameras, but we have a witness who saw the defendant standing right next to the victim when he fell. We have a police officer who confirms the defendant was the last person there. And we have a motive. Do you see how clear this is? Alexis locked eyes with Tate, seeing the smug pride in his gaze as he believed he had shut the door on her chances. But she wouldn't let him manipulate her for much longer. He could play dirty, but she knew these evidences weren't enough to convince the jury. She just needed one opportunity to expose them for what they were, and she would do so as soon as it was her turn to speak. The atmosphere in the courtroom had become more suffocating than ever. After the testimonies from 2 witnesses, the jury began to show signs of doubt. Some exchanged glances. Others subtly nodded as Prosecutor Tate continued to emphasize every detail that worked in his favor. The faces that had shown indifference when Alexis first entered the room now showed signs of wavering. Not everyone was fully convinced of her guilt, but no one was certain of her innocence either. And that was exactly what Tate wanted. He stepped forward, placing his hand on the jury box, his voice lowering with ominous implication. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you once again, the defendant has no representation. A federal prosecutor facing serious charges cannot find a single lawyer willing to defend her. Ask yourselves why that is." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Tate's words, while not an outright accusation, were full of suggestion. If Alexis were truly innocent, why would no one stand up for her? That question didn't need an answer, but it planted a seed of doubt in the jury's mind, one that Alexis knew would be hard to erase. She clenched her fists in her lap, her nails digging into her palms, but she didn't feel the pain. This was a tactic she had seen countless times in her career, attacking not just with evidence, but with psychology. Tate was playing this perfectly. He didn't need to present more concrete evidence. He just needed the jury to feel that she was guilty. He slowly walked across the room, his eyes scanning the space, then continued in a calm tone, as though he were explaining an obvious truth. "Ms. Carter is a smart, experienced prosecutor, but even she knows that standing alone in a trial like this is a risky decision." What does that mean? It means she has no one left to trust. The jury fell silent, but the atmosphere had shifted. The looks in their eyes were colder, sharper. Tate knew he had done his job. He turned to Alexis, giving her a half-smile of triumph before continuing. "No one here wants to see an innocent person punished. But can we afford the risk of ignoring the clear evidence in front of us?" One juror furrowed their brow. Another crossed their arms, appearing to contemplate. Alexis could see that Tate had shaken their resolve. If they hadn't stood by her from the start, now he had succeeded in swaying them to doubt her. She took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. Everything was unfolding just as Tate had hoped. And the audience, those following the trial through the media, could feel the injustice. But in the courtroom, Alexis was still alone, and she knew if she didn't act when the opportunity came, this could be the end for her. The tension in the courtroom was thick as the jury sat in the midst of the psychological manipulation Tate had perfectly executed. But Alexis Carter was not someone who would be easily crushed. When Judge Wallace nodded, signaling that she could begin her rebuttal, she slowly stood up. There was no rush, no defensive posture, only a cold confidence that took everyone in the courtroom by surprise. She walked toward the witness stand where Diana Brooks still sat, her hands pressed tightly together in a nervous grip. Alexis fixed her gaze on the woman, her eyes sharp but not threatening. She knew Diana wasn't the mastermind. She was just a pawn in Tate's larger game. But if there was a weak link in this chain, it was Diana. "Miss Brooks," Alexis began, her voice calm but firm enough to capture the attention of everyone in the room. "You said you saw me arguing with the victim?" Diana nodded, her eyes avoiding Alexis's. "Yes, that's correct." Alexis took a step forward, not giving Diana the chance to evade further questioning. "And after that, you said you heard a scream, correct?" "Yes." Alexis nodded as if confirming the information, but then she suddenly changed her approach. "Are you absolutely sure that scream came from the victim?" Diana hesitated for a split second, a brief moment, but enough for Alexis and the whole courtroom to notice. I think so," she said, her voice beginning to falter. "So you didn't actually see the victim being attacked?" Diana licked her lips, her gaze shifting uncomfortably. "I didn't see it firsthand, but when I looked back, he was on the ground." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Some members of the jury exchanged looks. Tate frowned, clearly displeased that his witness was beginning to waver. Alexis didn't stop. She took another step forward, locking eyes with Diana. "Do you know how far your position was from the scene?" Diana blinked, looking a little confused by the question. I can't say exactly, but maybe around 30 feet. 30 feet, Alexis repeated, then turned toward the jury. "That's nearly 10 meters, in a parking lot with inadequate lighting." She turned back to Diana. "Can you be absolutely certain about what you saw in those conditions?" Diana swallowed nervously. I just saw a figure." "A figure?" Alexis blinked, feigning surprise. So that means you can't be certain that the person standing near the victim was me? The room suddenly became so quiet that you could hear every breath. Diana stiffened. I thought it was you, but... So you guessed? Diana fell silent. She realized she had contradicted her earlier testimony. Tate shot up from his seat. Objection. Ms. Carter is pressuring the witness. Alexis calmly turned to Judge Wallace. Your Honor, I am simply clarifying the witness's testimony. Judge Wallace leaned back in his chair, looking at Diana, who was now clearly uncomfortable, then turned to Tate. Objection overruled. The witness may continue answering. Tate clenched his teeth but could do nothing further. Alexis returned her focus to Diana, her voice softening, no longer harsh as before. Miss Brooks, I understand that when witnessing a sudden event, our memories can be affected. But I want to ask you one final time. Are you absolutely certain that you saw me attack the victim? Diana lowered her head, avoiding the gaze of everyone in the room. I'm not sure. The courtroom fell into silence. Tate's hands balled into fists. The jury began to shift in their seats. Alexis knew this was just the beginning of her turn in the trial. The tide was starting to shift. The atmosphere in the courtroom had become tense as Alexis Carter slowly rose to her feet. If the jury had already started to waver after witness Diana Brooks expressed uncertainty, now was the time for Alexis to strike at the most critical weakness in the case, the lack of physical evidence. She walked steadily toward the witness stand where Officer Daniel Harper remained seated with his calm demeanor, but Alexis knew he wouldn't be able to maintain that confidence for much longer. Officer Harper, she began, her tone steady but with an underlying strength. As a police officer, I believe you've investigated many cases before, correct? Harper nodded. Yes. So, in a criminal assault case, would you agree that physical evidence plays a very important role? Harper furrowed his brow slightly but still answered cautiously. Yes, but not always. Physical evidence isn't always necessary to convict someone. Alexis smiled lightly, as if she had predicted this answer. I understand. Then let's talk about the physical evidence you found in this case. She picked up a file from her desk and raised it. Can you confirm that there were no surveillance videos of the incident at the scene? Harper swallowed. Correct. The cameras in the area weren't functioning at the time of the incident. Alexis turned to the jury, emphasizing the point. So we don't have any video footage of the event? No. We don't have any photographs from the scene showing that I committed the crime? No. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Alexis could see Tate gritting his teeth, but she didn't stop. She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving Harper. Let's talk about the victim, Officer Harper. Can you describe the injuries he sustained? Harper blinked, clearly uncomfortable as he realized the direction Alexis was taking. The victim had some minor scratches, but there were no broken bones or serious injuries. Alexis nodded, pretending to consider his response. So, there were no signs of a violent assault? No serious injuries. That's correct. She turned and looked directly at Tate, her voice slow but sharp. Then, Prosecutor Tate, can you explain to me and the court how a serious assault could leave no significant injuries? A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The jury exchanged glances, clearly beginning to recognize the contradictions in this case. Tate quickly stood up, trying to regain control. Your Honor, not every assault leaves serious injuries. We cannot rely on the extent of injuries to conclude whether a crime was committed. Alexis didn't let him off that easily. She took a step forward, her tone now more forceful. Oh, so do we have any direct witnesses who saw me commit the assault? Harper froze. No. Do we have any cameras recording my actions? No. Do we have any forensic evidence proving the victim was assaulted with force? Harper shook his head, this time slower. No. Alexis crossed her arms and turned to the jury, her gaze sweeping over them one by one. So, without video footage, without direct witnesses, without forensic evidence, on what basis am I being charged? The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Tate couldn't say anything. The jury was now forced to question the very foundation of Tate's case. Outside the courtroom, viewers following the trial through the media were undoubtedly starting to feel the injustice unraveling. But Alexis knew the battle wasn't over. She had just shattered the first layer of Tate's facade, and she wouldn't stop until every single lie was destroyed. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. Earlier, The jury had seemed to lean in Tate's favor, believing the case was an easy win for the prosecution. But after Alexis systematically exposed the weaknesses in Tate's evidence, some jurors began to show signs of hesitation. An older man reclined in his chair, arms crossed and brow furrowed, as if trying to piece together everything he had just heard. A young woman sitting beside him pressed her lips together and exchanged a glance with the person next to her. Alexis didn't miss these signals. She locked her gaze on the jury, observing their every small reaction. She had planted the seed of doubt, and now it was time to let it grow. But she knew Tate had noticed it too. He stood up, gripping his file tightly, before walking to the center of the room, maintaining the same confident stance he had had when the trial began. He cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on the jury as though trying to pull them back to the narrative he had built. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but a bit more strained than before, "I understand that Ms. Carter is an excellent orator. She has used sharp questions to distract from the case. But we cannot let emotion cloud the facts." Tate slowly walked past the rows of seats, his eyes sweeping over each member of the jury. "Remember, not all cases have video surveillance or direct witnesses. But that does not mean the crime did not occur. We have a motive. We have witnesses confirming the defendant was at the scene right before the victim fell. And we have one simple fact. No one else was there except for her." Some members of the jury nodded, but this time it was not as unified as before. The hesitation was still present, even though Tate was trying to regain control. Alexis noticed something important. He was feeling the pressure. He no longer had the absolute certainty he once had. She stood up slowly, moving toward the front, unfazed by Tate's speech. "Prosecutor Tate says no one else was there except for me." She paused, letting the statement sink into the jury's minds. "But the reality is, no one actually saw me do it. No witnesses, no video, no physical evidence. We cannot convict someone simply because they were present at the scene. If we do that, how many innocent people might be convicted just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time?" A woman in the jury blinked, clearly moved by Alexis's words. A middle-aged man frowned, looking down at his notes. These small signals told Alexis she had succeeded in shaking their absolute belief in Tate's case. Tate clenched his jaw but maintained his composure. He knew that if this continued, the case could start to veer off course from his original plan. He needed a decisive blow to bring the jury back to his side, and Alexis knew he was about to do something. But this time, she wouldn't let him control the situation. She looked directly at the jury, her gaze unwavering, her voice slow but powerful. "I am not asking you to believe me right away. I am simply asking that you think carefully. If there is no convincing evidence, if there are too many contradictions, can we truly say that justice is being served? Or is this just a political game with an innocent person as the scapegoat?" The room fell into silence. Tate may try to manipulate the truth, but Alexis knew that she had regained the initiative. The jury no longer viewed her as a guilty party. They saw her as someone fighting to protect the truth. And that was the first step toward turning the tide. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted drastically. The jury, who had once leaned toward Tate, now seemed to waver. The absolute confidence he had once exuded was beginning to crack. But Tate wasn't the type to let someone like Alexis Carter turn the tide against him. And that's when he decided to play dirty. Tate stood up dramatically, slamming a file down onto the table. He scanned the room, then turned toward Judge Wallace, his tone low but laden with insinuation. "Your Honor, I know Miss Carter is skilled in rhetoric, but I cannot allow this trial to be derailed. We have just uncovered an important new piece of evidence. Evidence that suggests the defendant deliberately concealed vital information during the investigation." Alexis furrowed her brow, her heart sinking. New evidence? Impossible. She had reviewed every piece of the case file. She knew exactly what the prosecution had in their possession. If Tate had something she hadn't seen, there was only one explanation. He had fabricated it. Tate lifted a document, pulling out a printout of an email. This email was sent from Ms. Carter's internal account to an anonymous source, in which she requests the removal or concealment of crucial evidence related to this case. He turned toward the jury, showing them the email. Subject line: "Clean up the traces now. Leave nothing that can link back to me." The courtroom erupted. Whispers filled the air as the jury gaped, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Onlookers from the press murmured as they scribbled down notes. This was a major blow to Alexis. She took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. This was clearly a forged document, but she knew that what mattered now was not the truth, but how the jury felt. And Tate had just planted a new seed of doubt in their minds. She immediately stood, her voice steady. Objection. This evidence is not in the case file. I have never seen it before. Prosecutor Tate is deliberately introducing an unverified document. Judge Wallace pushed his glasses up, glancing at Tate. Can you explain why this document was not provided during the discovery process? Tate did not flinch. He exhaled as though under pressure, but in reality, he was playing his role perfectly. Your Honor, this document was only discovered this morning. We have conducted preliminary verification and confirmed that it originates from the internal system where the defendant once worked. Therefore, we had to introduce it immediately to ensure justice is served. Alexis clenched her fists. Perfect. He doesn't have legitimate legal evidence, but he knows Judge Wallace won't reject a crucial document like this. She couldn't let this happen. Your Honor, she kept her voice calm but firm. This email could easily be fabricated. If Prosecutor Tate wishes to use it as evidence, I request an independent forensic investigation to verify its origin. Tate quickly interjected. Your Honor, time is of the essence. We cannot delay this trial simply because the defendant wants to drag out the process to avoid guilt. Alexis turned toward Wallace, her gaze challenging. We are talking about the legality of the evidence, not Prosecutor Tate's game of manipulation. Do you really want to allow an unverified document to change the fate of an innocent person? Wallace fell silent for a few seconds. Alexis could see the internal struggle in his eyes, but she also knew he wasn't on her side. And then, just as she had expected, he rendered his verdict. Objection denied. The evidence is admissible. A surge of fury rose within Alexis, but she knew better than to let it show. Tate gave a small, knowing smile, just enough for her to see, but not too blatant. He knew he had regained the upper hand. The jury in the courtroom looked visibly unsettled. Some nodded as if they now believed this was the final piece of evidence confirming Alexis's guilt. Others were still unsure, but Tate didn't need them all to believe him. He just needed enough votes to convict. Alexis sat back down, struggling to maintain her composure. She knew exactly how Tate played this game. He didn't care about the truth. He only needed the jury to feel that she was guilty. And now, with a forged yet legally accepted piece of evidence before them, she was in more danger than ever before. She clenched her fists, her eyes cold. Tate may win this battle, but he will not win the war. She will not allow him to manipulate justice so blatantly without fighting back. And that counterattack would begin the next time she had the opportunity. A heavy silence engulfed the courtroom after Judge Wallace accepted Tate's forged email as evidence. It took only a few seconds for the jury to slip back into doubt. The flicker of hope that Alexis had sparked in their minds was brutally extinguished. An older man reclined in his chair, arms crossed, his face pensive. A young woman nervously glanced at the others, clearly trying to find some certainty in the chaos. But what was most dangerous were the nods. A few of them had begun to believe Alexis was guilty. Tate looked at the jury, saying nothing but allowing them to reflect on what had just transpired. He knew that sometimes words didn't matter as much as feelings, and in this moment, he had succeeded in planting a feeling that Alexis couldn't be innocent. He didn't need to prove anything. He only needed to make them feel that what he was saying was the truth. Alexis gripped the edge of the table, her nails digging into her palm. She wanted to object, to scream that this was a fabrication, but she knew any emotional reaction would only make things worse. All she could do was sit still, wait, and endure. Outside the courtroom, millions were watching the trial unfold through the media. On social media, an uproar began to rise. This is outrageous. How could an unverified piece of evidence be accepted? This justice system is corrupt. This is clearly a setup. Alexis Carter cannot be guilty. But inside the courtroom, the public's voice didn't matter. Only 12 people in the jury had the power to decide her fate. When Tate returned to his seat, he no longer needed to act triumphant. He knew he had pushed her to the edge of defeat. Alexis sat there silently, watching everything collapse around her. She no longer had allies, no solid evidence to counter the accusations, and the jury was gradually leaning toward Tate. She could feel the trap closing in. She took a deep breath, but the suffocating feeling didn't go away. This wasn't just a trial. It was an insult, a message that Tate and the people behind him wanted to send. You dared to oppose us, and now we will crush you. In that moment of despair, her mind flashed back to the early days of her career as a prosecutor. She remembered the first time she walked into a courtroom, the nervous excitement mixed with resolve as she stood for justice. She had chosen this path because she believed the justice system could truly protect the powerless, the voiceless. And now, she realized she was in that very position she had once fought for others. Now it was time for her to fight for herself. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with the weight of failure. Tate sat confidently in his seat, the jury slowly tilting in his favor, and Judge Wallace showed no signs of reconsidering his decision. Alexis Carter had been cornered. But just as everything seemed to have crumbled, an unexpected glimmer of hope appeared. Her phone vibrated in the pocket of her blazer, a text message. She flinched. She had turned off her phone before entering the courtroom, and only a select few knew how to reach her during the trial. She glanced at Judge Wallace, who was engaged in a discussion with the court clerk, and quickly pulled out her phone under the table, opening the message. Check your inbox immediately. We have evidence that could destroy everything Tate has. She held her breath. The message came from Jordan Matthews, a former colleague at the federal prosecutor's office. She didn't have time to think too much. She opened her laptop, accessed her inbox, and immediately saw an email with the subject line, "Forgery evidence, urgent." She opened the attachment. It was a legal analysis of the email Tate had just used as evidence. Bolded text made her heart race. This email was created from a server not affiliated with the federal system. The metadata shows that the email was altered just 48 hours before being submitted into the case file. The IP address linked to the sending account belongs to a private law office with ties to Tate. Tate had forged the evidence. But that wasn't all. Below the attachment was another note from Jordan. We also recovered partial data from surveillance cameras near the scene. The video was deleted, but our tech team managed to restore a segment. Attached is the original file. You need to submit this immediately. Alexis could hardly believe her eyes. She opened the video clip and saw the victim in the case staggering through the parking lot, clearly intoxicated. After a few seconds, he tripped over a loose brick on the sidewalk and fell to the ground. There was no attack at all. A rush of adrenaline surged through her body. This was the counterattack she had been waiting for. This was the evidence that could immediately destroy Tate. She stood up abruptly, startling everyone in the courtroom. Your Honor, I have new evidence that must be considered immediately. Tate raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. What evidence? He tried to keep his voice calm, but there was something in his eyes that no longer held the same certainty. Alexis stepped forward, her voice stronger and more decisive than ever before. Evidence showing that Prosecutor Tate has used falsified documents and, more importantly, a recovered surveillance video from the scene proving that the victim fell on his own. The courtroom erupted. Whispers filled the air, and the jury looked at each other in stunned disbelief. Judge Wallace banged his gavel. Order. Miss Carter, can you provide this evidence now? Alexis nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I have the forensic analysis of the forged email, and I also have the video showing that no assault took place. Tate clenched his jaw, the first visible signs of losing control appearing. He stood up abruptly. Your Honor, this is clearly a farce. The defendant is deliberately causing chaos to delay the verdict. Alexis turned to face him, her eyes burning with a dangerous gleam. I don't need to create chaos, Prosecutor Tate. The truth speaks for itself. Judge Wallace exchanged a quick glance with the court clerk, then sighed. The court will accept the evidence. We will pause the trial for 20 minutes to review it. Alexis sat back down, but she knew the battle had shifted. Tate had placed himself on the defensive, and now she wouldn't stop until he was completely destroyed. The courtroom was filled with a tense stillness as the jury and the entire audience began to process the new evidence. The surveillance video was played on the large screen. No one spoke a word, but everyone's eyes were fixed on the image of the victim stumbling, tripping over a loose brick, and falling hard onto the concrete without anyone touching him. No assault, no attack, no crime at all. The air in the room seemed to freeze. One jury member set down his pen his brow furrowing. Another whispered something to the person next to them, their face full of disbelief. But most noticeable was Tate's reaction. He tried to remain calm, but a trace of panic began to show in his eyes. Alexis didn't miss her chance. She stood up and slowly walked to the center of the room, her gaze sweeping over the jury, then locking onto Tate's frozen face. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice sharp and commanding, "we've just seen the truth. A truth that Prosecutor Tate didn't want you to see. A truth he deliberately tried to hide to send me to prison." The courtroom exploded in whispers. Some jury members exchanged glances. Others turned to Tate, clearly questioning his motives. She walked closer to the prosecutor's table, her voice becoming slower but carrying more pressure. "Prosecutor Tate, can you explain why this video was not in the case file?" Tate clenched his jaw, clearly trying to find a way to react, but Alexis didn't give him the opportunity. "Or did you deliberately conceal it because it destroys your entire case?" Tate jumped up, clearly losing control. "I had no knowledge of this video. I didn't know." Alexis interrupted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You are the lead prosecutor of this case, and you didn't know there was a video that disproves your entire argument." He stammered, trying to regain his composure. "Maybe this video was deleted before we accessed the scene correctly." Alexis nodded, then suddenly turned, her eyes lighting up. "But who gave the order to delete it?" Tate froze. This was the fatal blow. There were a few seconds of silence, the tension so thick that everyone could feel the weight of each breath in the room. Tate had no answer. She didn't stop. She walked over to her desk, grabbed the file Jordan Matthews had sent, and held it up for everyone to see. "And that's not all. I have another piece of evidence. A legal document from tech experts proving that the email Prosecutor Tate used to accuse me was forged." One jury member gasped. Another whispered to the person next to them. Alexis slammed the file onto the table in front of Tate. "The IP address of the email account that sent this email leads back to a law office closely tied to you. Do you want to explain that, Prosecutor Tate?" The courtroom fell dead silent. Tate opened his mouth to say something, but this time he had no defense left. Judge Wallace stared at Tate, clearly rethinking his entire stance on this case. Alexis could see the jurors had completely changed their minds. Some looked horrified as they realized they had almost handed down an unjust verdict, manipulated by Tate. Alexis took a deep breath, then turned to the jury, her voice slow but filled with power. "Ladies and gentlemen, justice has been distorted in this case. A prosecutor deliberately fabricated evidence, deceived you, and almost sent an innocent person to prison." She locked eyes with each juror. "So, do you still believe I'm guilty?" No one spoke, but she knew that she had just won. The courtroom was submerged in a deathly silence. What had just transpired felt like a seismic shock, completely shattering the web of lies Tate had woven throughout the trial. The jury, once completely under his control, now appeared shocked and filled with doubt. Judge Jonathan Wallace, who had remained cold and indifferent throughout the proceedings, now clearly showed a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He adjusted his glasses and rubbed his temple as if trying to process the overwhelming information that had just been presented. He stared at the file on Tate's desk, then turned to look at Alexis, for the first time appearing to genuinely consider her words. But the most stunned of all was Michael Tate. He stood frozen, his body rigid, no longer the calm, confident figure he had been earlier. His hands gripped the table tightly, his eyes flickering over the jury before landing on Judge Wallace, as if desperately searching for a lifeline. But this time, no one could save him. He flipped through the documents Alexis had presented, but the words on the paper only made him more confused. The IP address linked to a law firm with ties to him? He knew this was true, and more importantly, now everyone in the courtroom knew it too. A sharp clink rang out as a jury member dropped their pen onto the table. Another, a middle-aged woman, placed her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. A few others shook their heads, unable to believe they had almost been deceived. In the gallery, reporters and onlookers buzzed in unison, their phones and cameras flashing as they began documenting this historic moment. Some whispered to each other, while others frantically typed out new headlines for their stories. Case reversal. Prosecutor allegedly manipulated evidence. Shocking truth exposed. Michael Tate could face investigation. Courtroom drama turns. Prosecutor Tate loses control. Tate could hear all the whispers. His face flushed crimson, then paled in just a matter of seconds. He turned toward Judge Wallace, his voice desperately trying to remain calm, but betraying his growing urgency. "Your Honor," he said, swallowing hard. "We need to suspend this trial immediately to re-examine these documents." Alexis immediately interjected, her eyes sharp as a razor. "No, Prosecutor Tate. You don't need time to review these documents. You know very well they are genuine." A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. Judge Wallace leaned back in his chair, silently watching Tate. In his eyes, the trust he once held for Tate had vanished, replaced by doubt. A long pause followed. No one spoke. Tate glanced around the room, trying to regain some semblance of control, but he knew the game had changed completely. For the first time in the trial, he was the one on the defensive. Alexis stood motionless, watching him, and she knew that now was the time to deliver the final blow. The courtroom was suffocatingly tense as the jury rose from their seats to deliberate. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were fixed on the door through which the jury had disappeared, gazes filled with a mix of hope and fear. This was no longer just a trial. It had become a battle between truth and a manipulated justice system. Alexis Carter sat silently in the defendant's chair, her hands resting on the table, her fingers subconsciously tightening into a fist. She had done everything she could. She had exposed the forged evidence, made Tate lose control in the middle of the trial, and forced the jury to face the truth. But would that be enough to win? Across the room, Michael Tate sat motionless, his lips pressed together, his gaze darkened. Gone was the smug demeanor, the half-smile of arrogance. He knew he had lost, but he still said nothing, waiting like everyone else. The door to the jury room swung open. An older man, the jury foreman, stepped out. The courtroom fell silent. Each of his footsteps echoed in the vast room. He sat down in his position, exchanged a brief word with Judge Wallace, then stood up, holding the verdict paper in his hand. Judge Wallace took a deep breath, trying to maintain his calm, but even he couldn't hide the tension spreading throughout the room. "Foreman, has the jury reached a verdict?" The man nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." He glanced at Alexis, then at Tate, before reading each word clearly and decisively. "We, the jury, after reviewing all the evidence, find the defendant, Alexis Carter, not guilty." For a moment, absolute silence enveloped the room. Then, almost immediately, the courtroom erupted. Whispers spread, relieved sighs, and a few quiet cheers rose from the audience. In the press area, pens began to scribble furiously, and phones were quickly raised to update the breaking news. Alexis Carter acquitted. A verdict that shakes the justice system. A slap in the face to Prosecutor Tate. The truth has finally prevailed. Alexis closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of release. She had done it. She had won. But more than that, she had protected justice, the very thing Tate had tried to distort. She opened her eyes, turned, and looked at Tate. He was still sitting there, his face frozen, his fists clenched tight. He couldn't accept the reality that he had been defeated on his own turf. Alexis stood slowly. She looked directly at the jury, then toward the spectators who had followed every step of her journey. This victory was not just hers. It was the victory of all those who had been trampled by this system. But as she stepped away from the defendant's dock, she knew the battle wasn't over, and the harsh truth was, justice was not always served so easily. Michael Tate remained silent. He sat still in his chair, eyes fixed on the table, his face stiff as stone. The battle he thought he had already won had just crumbled before his eyes, and now he was the one being judged. But the worst was yet to come. One of Alexis's attorneys approached the prosecutor's table and placed a stack of documents down. "Your Honor," he said, his voice sharp, "we request an official investigation into Prosecutor Tate based on evidence that he deliberately introduced falsified evidence and manipulated the trial." Those words hit like a devastating blow. Tate jumped to his feet, his face turning bright red. "This is slander," he shouted, desperately clinging to the last bit of power he thought he still had. "I was just doing my job." "You were wrong," Judge Wallace interrupted, his voice no longer patient as before. "And I won't let that go unnoticed." Tate froze. For the first time in the entire trial, he looked at Wallace with real fear in his eyes. Judge Wallace placed his hands on the desk, sighed heavily. He wasn't blameless either. He had allowed his biases to guide him, let Tate manipulate the trial, and almost sent an innocent person to jail. But now, with everything clear, he couldn't ignore his own responsibility. This court will formally request an investigation into Prosecutor Michael Tate to examine his misconduct in this case, he declared. He will be suspended from duty until the investigation is concluded. The courtroom buzzed. Some reporters typed furiously, quickly writing new headlines. From leading prosecutor to under investigation. Michael Tate loses everything in one trial. Judge Wallace forced to admit mistakes. Is the justice system truly fair? Tate shook his head, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. But there was no way out for him now. When the trial ended, Alexis Carter walked out of the courtroom. She didn't smile in victory, didn't celebrate like most innocent people would after being exonerated, because she knew the battle wasn't truly over. She took a deep breath as she stepped outside the courthouse. The sunlight was blinding after days of being overshadowed by the darkness of injustice. But even that light couldn't erase the wounds this trial had left. Reporters immediately swarmed her, microphones and cameras thrust in her face. Miss Carter, can you share your feelings right now? Do you think justice has finally been served? Is there anything you want to say to those who once believed you were guilty? Alexis didn't stop. She walked past them without answering a single question. She didn't need to speak. The truth had already spoken for itself. But as she walked toward the parking lot, something strange happened. A court officer approached and handed her an unmarked brown envelope. It came for you this morning, the officer said, his face a bit puzzled. Alexis furrowed her brow, took the envelope, and tore it open right there. Inside was just a simple sheet of paper with a typed message. You may have won this time, but the war is not over. A chill ran down her spine. She looked around but didn't see anyone suspicious. Who had sent this letter? And what were they warning her about? She gripped the paper tightly in her hand, took a deep breath. She wasn't afraid. Because justice wasn't just a battle, it was a long war. And if they thought she would stop after today, they had made a huge mistake. Because Alexis Carter never backs down. As Alexis Carter stepped out of the courthouse, she could feel an unusual atmosphere enveloping her. Beneath the harsh sunlight, her footsteps echoed steadily on the stone steps. But in her ears, the chaotic sounds of the world still lingered. A crowd of reporters jostled for position, microphones and cameras aimed directly at her, flashbulbs flashing continuously as if they wanted to capture every moment of the woman who had just won a brutal legal battle. Questions were shouted relentlessly, but she didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't pay attention to the headlines being written at that very moment. Justice had stood by her, but the price she had paid was too high to celebrate. As she reached the parking lot, a court officer approached her holding a brown envelope. This was sent to you this morning, the officer said, his voice a mix of curiosity and caution. Alexis stopped, took the envelope, and silently opened it. Inside was just a single sheet of white paper with neatly typed, cold words. You may have won this time, but the war is not over. She stood still for a moment, letting the words sink in. A chill ran down her spine, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the clear realization that this trial was only a small part of a much larger picture. She glanced around, trying to spot any sign of who had sent the letter, but all she saw were faces passing by. No one stopped. No one acted out of the ordinary. But she knew someone was watching her. Her hand tightened around the paper before she slowly folded it and tucked it into her jacket pocket. This wasn't the first threat she had received in her career, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But this time, it carried a different meaning. No longer were there anonymous warnings. No longer were there shadowy forces working in the dark. Her enemy was standing right before her, in the very system she had once trusted. Alexis took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs before exhaling slowly. She wouldn't allow herself to sink into confusion. She had won, but that didn't mean the battle was over. If they thought she would stop now, they had misjudged her. She wasn't fighting just to clear her name. She fought for the truth, for those crushed by this system, for those who had no voice. She turned and walked toward her car, each step more resolute than the last. Justice is not a moment. It is a long war. And Alexis Carter, though alone, would never back down. As Alexis Carter stepped into her car, she cast one final glance at the courthouse behind her, a place where she had just fought not only for her own innocence, but to expose a system tainted by corruption and manipulation. The battle may have been won, but she knew the war was far from over. The anonymous letter in her pocket was a chilling reminder that those in the shadows would not stop. Justice, as she had always known, was not handed out freely. It had to be fought for, again and again. Yet, the threat did not shake her resolve. If anything, it only made her stronger. She gripped the steering wheel, taking a slow, deep breath. The road ahead was uncertain, but she had never been one to back down. The system she once believed in had shown its darkest side, but she would not let it silence her. This was no longer just about her. It was about all those who had been wrongfully accused, silenced, and crushed under the weight of injustice. Justice was never easy, but she was willing to keep fighting for it, no matter the cost. Want to see what happens next? Don't forget to subscribe now so you won't miss a single moment of this gripping story where truth is always a battle waiting to be won.